In the capital markets, the U.S. Federal Reserve, often referred to as the Fed, plays a paramount role. It's like the conductor of a grand symphony. Its every move, every interest rate hike, every rate cut, every act of quantitative easing directly dictates the rhythm of global capital markets. It seems the market only needs to heed its baton to find the direction of fortune. But there's a fundamental problem. Market development never follows a fixed score, and the Fed's policymaking committee is, after all, made up of mere mortals. They're not prophets. They're human, and they make mistakes. So, what is the historical record of this world's foremost economic symphony? Frankly, it's not ideal. Especially under the tenure of current Chairman Jerome Powell, this record is hardly even passing. Recently, however, the conductor seems to have finally begun to reflect, even admitting his mistakes. On August 22, 2025, at the annual Jackson Hole meeting of global central banks, Powell delivered a crucial speech. In this speech, he acknowledged that the monetary policy framework adopted by the Federal Reserve in 2020 had significant flaws. Let's briefly review that framework, which has been proven wrong. In 2020, faced with prolonged low inflation, the Federal Reserve introduced a policy called flexible average inflation targeting. Simply put, it believed that past inflation had been too low, so it intended to deliberately allow inflation to modestly exceed the 2% target over the next period of time to make up for the previous deficit. This idea sounds like turning up the air conditioner a little higher in the summer to average the temperature when it's cold in the winter. It's full of theoretical assumptions. Reality has dealt them a resounding blow. He said this in his speech. Let me review a few key points. First, he said, until the end of 2021, we believe inflation will subside quickly, without requiring us to tighten policy significantly. The subtext of this statement is, our initial judgment that inflation was temporary turned out to be terribly wrong. Second, he admitted, the inflation that arrived in the months following our 2020 policy change was neither intentional nor moderate. The subtext is this. We were trying to add a little hot water to the pool, but we accidentally set off the boiler room, and the whole situation spiraled out of control. Renowned market analyst Mike Shedlock offered a sharp assessment, arguing that Powell's remarks were the closest he could come to admitting, we screwed up. But friends, we must recognize that Federal Reserve officials may not necessarily be masters of business, but they are certainly masters of language. Powell's admission was full of glibness and self-deception. He blamed the mistakes on the unexpected impact of the post-pandemic economic reopening, but avoided addressing the more fundamental errors made by himself and his predecessors. What was this fundamental error? Their perennial disregard for the massive asset bubble inflated by zero interest rates and quantitative easing. Whether under Bernanke or Powell, the Federal Reserve stubbornly insisted that the rampant rise in housing prices and the irrational boom in the stock market didn't constitute inflation. They focused solely on the seemingly benign Consumer Price Index, CPI, after technically manipulated results, turning a blind eye to the asset bubbles they had themselves created. Ultimately, when 3 rounds of unprecedented, free money stimulus during the pandemic collided with pent-up consumer demand, the volcano of inflation finally erupted. However, due to its flawed theoretical framework, the Fed continued with quantitative easing even as inflation was already raging, only being forced to slam on the brakes and raise interest rates at the last minute. Faced with the Fed's dismal performance and the reality of its low-level shoddy operations, investors should wake up. Thus, Powell's admission was less a sincere reflection than a cutting back to launch a new policy framework. They abandoned some proven foolish old concepts, but remained shrouded in secrecy about the underlying logic that led to these errors. This leads us to ponder a deeper question. If this institution's decision-making is so subpar, what exactly is the purpose of the Federal Reserve? To give you a more intuitive understanding of the Fed's decision-making quality, let's quickly review how this group of highly educated economists has steadily led the U.S. economy into a slump over the past 2 decades. The Greenspan era, 2000 to 2007, in response to the bursting of the dot-com bubble in 2001, the Federal Reserve, led by Greenspan, pushed interest rates too low and held them there for too long. The result? They successfully inflated one of the largest real estate bubbles in history, directly laying the groundwork for the 2008 global financial crisis. The Bernanke era, 2012 to 2019 after the 2008 financial crisis, Bernanke ushered in an unprecedented era of quantitative easing, QE. When house prices bottomed out in 2012, which should have been a clear signal to exit the accommodative policy, the Fed did the opposite and intensified QE. Bernanke himself confidently declared in 2005, "There's no real estate bubble that's going to burst." History has proven this to be a colossal joke. The Yellen era, 2017 after taking over, Yellen continued her obsession with combating too low inflation. When housing and stock prices began to soar again, upon leaving office in 2017, she stated that her only regret was that she hadn't injected enough money to push inflation up to the 2% target. She completely ignored the fact that another, even larger asset bubble was forming. The Powell era, 2020 to present, we are now witnessing the fact that Powell has perfectly inherited the legacy of his predecessors. First, in 2020, he introduced the absurd average inflation targeting system. Then, in 2021, alongside then Treasury Secretary Yellen, he repeatedly assured the market that inflation was only transitory and that massive fiscal stimulus could not cause an inflationary problem. We can see that this wasn't the mistake of a single individual, but rather a systemic, generational, collective think. They all firmly believe in economic theories that have been repeatedly disproven by reality, such as the Phillips curve, and are selectively blind to massive asset price bubbles. Analyst Mish, in his article, aptly describes them as trained economic idiots. He argues that these individuals may have high IQs, but they lack basic common sense and are constrained by their own economic models, which are no longer in touch with reality. In my opinion, it's not that they don't understand, but rather that other factors have distorted their perceptions and eroded their consciences. Faced with such a dismal performance, Mish even jokingly published a policy platform for his campaign to become the next Federal Reserve chairman on his blog. While full of sarcasm, this platform directly addresses the core flaws of the current monetary system. Let me briefly outline a few points. First, explain to the nation why we don't need the Federal Reserve. Because history has proven that an independent central bank only creates increasingly severe economic boom and bust cycles. Fourth, completely eliminate the Federal Reserve's trillion-dollar balance sheet within 2 to 3 years. 13th, when reporters ask me about my views on the economy, I will say, I don't know, and no one knows. When asked about fiscal policy, I will say, Congress and the President are out of control. Finally, I will fire everyone involved in interest rate decisions and resign myself. This seemingly absurd plan hides a profound insight. A small elite, no matter how brilliant, can never understand the true needs of a complex economy better than the market itself. Trying to set the most important price, the price of money, through centrally planned monetary policy is the root of the problem. They are not prophets, yet they possess the power to subvert the capital markets. The Fed's very existence is the biggest problem. So, beyond these macroeconomic policy errors, are there also problems with the core theoretical tools the Fed relies on? Is the inflation expectations management they repeatedly emphasize a science or a self-deceiving psychological game? This is the core issue we will delve into in the next episode.